Okay, well, I hope you're going to get yourself settled. I hope you're going to get yourself comfortable. And I hope you find this weird little story. Because remember, this just comes from Women's Weird. Unseen, Unfeared by Francis Stevens. Now remember, if you're watching, say hello. Do say hello. If you're new, the chat is full of lovely people. I don't look at the chat during the reading, and I will look at it afterwards. But my advice is you settle back, relax, Monday night, enjoy, if you can, this story. This unsettling, weird, supernatural story. Unseen, Unfeared by Francis Stevens or Gertrude Bennett. Part 1. I had been dining with my ever-interesting friend Mark Jenkins at a little Italian restaurant near South Street. It was a chance meeting. Jenkins is too busy usually to make our dinner engagements. Over our highly seasoned food and sour, thin red wine, he spoke of little odd incidents and adventures of his profession, nothing very vital or important, of course. Jenkins is not the sort of detective who first detects and then pours the egotistical and revealing details of achievement in the ears of every acquaintance, however appreciative. But when I spoke of something I'd seen in the morning papers, he laughed. Poor old Doc Holt. Fascinating old codger to anyone who really knows him. Had his friendship for years, since I was first on the city force and saved a young assistant of his from jail on a false charge. And they had to drag him into the poisoning of this young sport, Ralph Peeler. Why are you so sure he couldn't have been implicated? I asked. But Jenkins only shook his head with a quiet smile. I have reasons for believing otherwise, was all I could get out of him on the score. But, he added, the only reason he was suspected at all is the superstitious dread of these ignorant people around him. Can't see why he lives in such a place. I know for a fact he doesn't have to. Doc's got money of his own. He's an amateur chemist and dabbler in different sorts of research work, and I suspect he's been guilty of showing off. Result, they all swear he has the evil eye and holds forbidden communion with invisible powers. Smoke. Jenkins offered me one of his invariably good cigars, which I accepted, saying thoughtfully, a man has no right to trifle with the superstitions of ignorant people. Sooner or later, it spells trouble. Did in this case, they swore up and down that he sold love charms openly and poisons secretly, and that together with his living so near to somebody else, got him temporarily suspected. But my tongue's running away with me, as usual. As usual, I retorted impatiently. You open up with all the frankness of a Chinese diplomat. He beamed upon me engagingly and rose from the table with a glance at his watch. Sorry to leave you, Blaisdell, but I have to meet Jimmy Brennan in 10 minutes. He so clearly did not invite my further company that I remained seated for a little while after his departure, and took my own way homeward. Those streets always held for me a certain fascination, particularly at night. They're so unlike the rest of the city, so foreign in appearance, with their shabby stores, always open until late evening, their unbelievably cheap goods displayed as much outside the shops as in them, hung on the fronts and laid out on tables by the curb and in the street itself. Tonight, however, neither people nor stores in any sense appealed to me. The mixture, mostly bareheaded, unkempt, and generally unhygienic in appearance, struck me as merely revolting. They were all humans, and I too was human. Some way I did not like the idea. Puzzled a trifle, for I am more inclined to sympathize with poverty than to accuse it, I watched the faces as I passed. Never before had I observed how stupid, how bestial, how brutal were the countenances of the dwellers in this region. I actually shuddered when an old-clothes man, a grey-bearded man, brushed me as he toiled past with his barrow. There was a sense of evil in the air, a warning of things which it is wise for a clean man to shun and keep clear of. The impression became so strong that before I had walked 2 squares, I began to feel physically ill. Then it occurred to me that the one glass of cheap Chianti I had drunk might have something to do with the feeling. Who knew how that stuff had been manufactured, or whether the juice of the grape entered at all into this ill-favoured composition? Yet I doubted if it were the real cause of my discomfort. By nature, I'm rather a sensitive, impressionable sort of chap. In some way tonight, this neighbourhood with its sordid sights and smells had struck me wrong. My sense of impending evil was merging into actual fear. This would never do. There was only one way to deal with an imaginative temperament like mine: conquer its vagaries. If I left South Street with this nameless dread upon me, I would never pass down it again without the recurrence of the feeling. I should simply have to stay here until I got the better of it. That was all. I paused on a corner before a shabby but brightly lighted little drugstore. Its gleaming windows and the luminous green of its conventional glass showed jars made the brightest spot on the block. I realized that I was tired, but hardly wanted to go in there and rest. I knew what the company would be like in its shabby, sticky soda fountain. As I stood there, my eyes fell on a long white canvas sign across from me, and its black and red lettering caught my attention. See the great unseen. Come in. This means you, free to all. Museum of Fakes, I thought, but also reflected that if it were a show of some kind, I could sit down for a while, rest, and fight off this increasing obsession of non-existent evil. That side of the street was almost deserted, and the place itself might well be nearly empty. Part 2. I walked over, but with every step, my sense of dread increased. Dread of I knew not what. Bodiless, inexplicable horror had met me in a net. These strands, being intangible without reason for existence, I could by no means throw off. It was not the people now, none of them were about me. There in the open lighted street, with no sight nor sound of terror to assail me, I was the shivering victim of such fear as I had never known as was possible. Yet still I would not yield. Setting my teeth and fighting with myself as with some pet animal gone mad, I forced my steps to slowness and walked along the sidewalk seeking entrance. Just here there were no shops, but several doors reached, in which each cased by means of a few iron-railed stone steps. I chose the one in the middle, beneath the sign. In that neighbourhood there were museums, shops, and other commercial enterprises conducted in many shabby old residences, such as were these. Behind the glazing of the door I'd chosen, I could see a dim, pinkish light, but on either side the windows were quite dark. Trying the door, I found it unlocked. As I opened it, a party of Italians passed me on the pavement below, and I looked back at them over my shoulder. They were gaily dressed, men, women, and children, laughing and chattering to one another, probably on their way to some wedding or other festivity. In passing, one of the men glanced up at me, and involuntarily I shuddered back against the door. He was a young man, handsome after the swarthy manner of his race, but never in my life had I seen a face so expressive of pure, malicious cruelty, naked and unashamed. Our eyes met, and his seemed to light up with a vile gleaming, as if all the wickedness of his nature had come to a focus in the look of concentrated hate he gave me. They went by, but for some distance I could see him watching me, chin on shoulder, till he and his party were swallowed up in the crowd of musketeers further down the street. Sick and trembling from that encounter merely of eyes, though it had been, I threw aside my partly smoked cigar and entered. Within there was a small vestibule, whose ancient tessellated floor was grimy, and with the passing of many feet I could feel the grit of dirt under my shoes, and it rasped on my rawly quivering nerves. The inner door stood partly open. Going on, I found myself in a bare, dirty hallway, was greeted by the sour, musty, poverty-stricken smell common to dwellings of the very ill-to-do. Beyond there was on a stairway carpeted with ragged grass matting. A gas jet turned low. Inside a very dusty pink globe was the light I had seen without. Listening, the house seemed entirely silent. Surely this was no place of public amusement of any kind whatever. More likely it was a rooming house, and I had, after all, mistaken the entrance. To my intense relief, since coming inside, the worst agony of my unreasonable terror had passed away. If I could only get in some place where I could sit down and be quiet, probably I should be rid of it for good. Determining to try another entrance, I was about to leave the bare hallway when one of several doors along the side of it suddenly opened, and a man stepped out into the hall. "Well," he said, looking at me keenly, but with not the least show of surprise at my presence. I beg your pardon," I replied. "The door was unlocked, and I came in here thinking it was the entrance to the exhibit. What do they call it? The Great Unseen? The one that is mentioned on that long white sign. Can you tell me which door is the right one?" "I can." With that brief answer, he stopped and stared at me again. He was a tall, lean man, somewhat stooped, but possessing considerable dignity of bearing. For that neighbourhood, he appeared uncommonly well dressed, and his long, smooth-shaven face was noticeable because while his complexion was dark and his eyes coal-black, above them the heavy brows and his hair were almost silvery white. His age might have been anything over the 60 mark. I grew tired of being stared at. "If you can, and won't, then never mind." I observed a trifle irritably and turned to go, but his sharp exclamation halted me. "No," he said. "No." Forgive me for pausing. It was not hesitation, I assure you, to think that one even has to come all day. They pass my sign out there, pass, and fear to enter. But you are different. You are not of these timorous, ignorant peasants. You ask me to tell you the right door. Here it is. Here." And he struck the panel of the door, which had closed behind him, so that the sharp yet hollow sound of it echoed up through the silent house. Now it may be thought that after all my senseless terror in the open street, so strange a welcome from so odd a showman would have brought the feeling back full force. But there is an emotion stronger to a certain point than fear. This queer old fellow aroused my curiosity. What kind of museum could it be that he accused the passing public of fearing to enter? Nothing really terrible, surely, or he would have been closed by the police. And normally, I'm not an unduly timorous person. "So it's in there, is it?" I asked, coming toward him. "And I'm to be the sole audience. Come, that will be an interesting experience." I was half laughing now. "The most interesting in the world," the old man, with a solemnity which rebuked my lightness. With that he opened the door, passed inward, and closed it again, in my very face. I stood staring at it blankly. The panels, I remember, had originally been painted white, but now the paint was flaked and blistered and grey with dirt and dirty finger marks. Suddenly it occurred to me that I had no wish to enter there. Whatever was behind it could be scarcely worth seeing, or he would not choose such a place for its exhibition. With the old man's vanishing, my curiosity had cooled, but just as I again turned to leave, the door opened, and this singular showman stuck his white eyebrowed face through the aperture. He was frowning impatiently. "Come in! Come in!" he snapped, and promptly withdrawing his head, once more closed the door. "He has something in there he doesn't want should get out," was a very natural conclusion which I drew. Well, since it can hardly be anything dangerous, and he's so anxious, I should see it. Here goes. With that I turned the soled white porcelain handle and entered. The room I came into was neither very large nor very brightly lighted. In no way did it resemble a museum or lecture room. On the contrary, it seemed to have been fitted up quite a well-appointed laboratory. The floor was linoleum covered, and there were glass cases along the walls whose shelves were filled with bottles, specimen jars, graduates, and the like. A large table in one corner bore what looked like an odd sort of camera, and a larger one in the middle of the room was fitted with a long rack filled with bottles and test tubes, and was besides littered with papers, glass slides, and various paraphernalia which my ignorance failed to identify. There were several cases of books, a few plain wooden chairs, and in the corner a large iron sink with running water. My host, the white hair and black eyes, was awaiting me, standing near the larger table. He indicated one of the wooden chairs with a thin forefinger that shook a little, either from age or eagerness. Sit down. Have no fear but that you will be interested, my friend. Have no fear at all of anything. As he said it, he fixed his dark eyes upon me and stared harder than ever. But the effect of his words were the opposite of their meaning. I did sit down because my knee gave under me. But if in the outer hall I'd lost my terror, it now returned twofold upon me. Out there the light had been faint, dingily roseate, indefinite, but I had not perceived how this old man's face was a mask, living malice, cruelty, hate, and a certain masterful contempt. Now I knew the meaning of my fear, whose warning I would not heed. Now I knew that I had walked into the very trap from which my abnormal sensitiveness had striven in vain to save me. Part 3. Again I struggled within me, bit at my lip, till I tasted blood, and presently the blind paroxysm passed. It must have been longer in going than I thought, and the old man must have all that time been speaking, for when I could once more control my attention, hear and see him, he had taken up a position near the sink about 10 feet away, and was addressing me with a sort of platform manner, as if I had been the large audience whose absence he had deplored. "And so," he was saying, "I was forced to make these plates very carefully, to truly represent the characteristic hues of each separate organism. Now, in colour work of every kind, the film is necessarily extremely sensitive. Doubtless you are familiar in the general way with the exquisite transparencies produced by colour photography of the single plate type." He paused, and trying to act like a normal human being, I observed, "I saw some nice landscapes down in that way last week at the illustrated lecture in the Franklin Hall." He scowled and made an impatient gesture at me with his hand. "I can proceed better without interruptions," he said. "My pause was purely oratorical." I meekly subsided, and he went on in his original loud, clear voice. He would have made an excellent lecturer before a much larger audience, if only his voice could have lost that eerie, ringing note. Thinking of that, I must have missed some more, and when I caught it again, he was saying, "As I've indicated, the original plate is the final picture. Now, many of these organisms are extremely hard to photograph, and microphotography in color is particularly difficult. In consequence, to spoil a plate tries the patience of the photographer. They are so sensitive, and the ordinary dark-room ruby lamp would instantly ruin them, and they must therefore be developed either in darkness or by a special light produced by interposing thin sheets of tissue of a particular shade of green and of a yellow between lamp and plate, and even that will often cause ruinous fog. Now, I, finding it hard to handle them so, made numerous experiments with a view to discovering some glass or fabric or other colour which should add to the safety of the green without robbing it of all efficiency. All proved equally useless, but intermittently I persevered until last week." His voice dropped to an almost confidential tone, and he leaned slightly toward me. I was cold from my neck to my feet, and my head was burning. I tried to force an appreciative smile. "Last week," he continued impressively, "I had a prescription filled at the corner drug store. The bottle was sent home to me wrapped in a piece of what I first took to be a whitish, slightly opalescent paper. Later I decided it was some kind of membrane. When I questioned the druggist seeking its source, he said it was a sheet of paper that was around a bundle of herbs from South America, and he had no more and doubted if I could trace it. He'd wrapped my bottle, so because he was in haste, the sheet was handy. I can hardly tell you what first inspired me to try that membrane. My photographic work. It was merely dull white with a faint hint of opalescence, except when held against the light. Then it became quite translucent and quite brightly prismatic. For some reason it occurred to me that this reflective effect might help in breaking up the actinic rays, the rays which affect the sensitive emulsion. So that night I inserted it behind the sheets of green and yellow tissue next to the lamp, prepared my trays and chemicals, laid my plate holders to hand, turned off the white light, and turned on the green. There was nothing in his words to inspire fear. It was a wearisomely detailed account of his struggles with photography, yet he again paused impressively. I wished that he might never speak again. I was desperately contemptibly in dread of the thing he might say next. Suddenly he threw himself erect. The stoop went out of his shoulders, and he threw back his head and laughed. It was a hollow sound, as if he laughed into a trumpet. I won't tell you what I saw. Why should I? Your own eyes shall bear witness, but this much I'll say, so that you may better understand. When our poor, sensitive vision can perceive a thing, we say that it is visible. When the nerves of touch can feel it, we say that it is tangible. Yet I tell you, there are beings intangible to our physical sense, yet whose presence is felt by the spirit and invisible to our eyes, merely because those organs are not attuned to the light as reflected from their bodies. But light passed through the screen, which we are about to use as a wavelength novel to the scientific world, and by it you shall see the eyes of the flesh, that which has been invisible since life began. Have no fear. He stopped to laugh again, and his mirth was yellow-toothed, menacing. Have no fear. He reiterated, and with that he stretched his hand toward the wall. There came a click, and we were in the black, impenetrable darkness. I wanted to spring up, to seek the door by which I had entered and rush out of it, but the paralysis of unreasoning terror held me fast. I could hear him moving about in the darkness, and a moment later a faint green glimmer sprang up in the room. Its source was over the large sink, where I supposed he'd developed his precious colour plates. Every instant, as my eyes became accustomed to the dimness, I could see more clearly. Green light is peculiar. It may be far fainter than red, and at the same time far more illuminating. The old man was standing beneath it, and his face, by that ghastly radiance, had the exact look of a dead man's. Beside this, however, I could observe nothing appalling. That, continued the man, is the simple developing light of which I have spoken. Now watch, for what you are about to behold no mortal man but myself has ever seen before. For a moment he fussed with a green lamp over the sink. It was so constructed that all the direct rays struck downward. He opened a flap at the side for a moment, and there was a streak of comforting white luminescence from within. Then he inserted something and slid it slowly in and closed the flap. The thing he put in, the South American membrane, it must have been, instead of decreasing the light, increased it. Amazingly, the hue was changed from green to greenish grey. The whole room sprang into view, a livid, ghastly chamber filled with, overcrawled by what? My eyes fixed themselves, fascinated, on something that moved by the old man's feet. It writhed there on the floor like a huge, repulsive starfish, an immense armed-legged thing. It twisted convulsively. It was smooth, as if made of rubber, with whitish green in colour, and presently raised its great round blob of a body on tottering tentacles, crept towards my host and writhed upward. Yes, it climbed up his legs, his body. He stood there erect, arms folded, and stared sternly down at the thing which climbed. But the whole room was alive with other creatures than that. Everywhere I looked, they were there. Centipedish things with yard-long bodies, detestable, furry spiders that lurked in shadows, sausage-shaped, translucent horrors that moved and floated through the air. They dived here and there between me and the light, and I could see its brighter greenness through their greenish bodies. Worse, though, far worse. These were the things with human faces, mask-like, monstrous, huge, gaping mouths, and slit-like eyes. I find I cannot write them. There was that about them which makes their memory, even now, intolerable. The old man was speaking again, and every word echoed in my brain like the ringing of a gong. Fear nothing. Among such of these do you move every hour of the day and the night. Only you and I have seen. For God is merciful, and has spared our race from sight. But I am not merciful. I loathe the race which gave these creatures birth, the race which must be so surrounded by invisible, unguessed, but blessed beings, and chooses these for its companions. All the world shall see and know. One by one shall they come here, learn the truth, and perish. For who can survive in the ultimate of terror than I, too, shall find peace, and leave the earth to its heritage of man-created horrors. Do you know what these are? Whence they came? His voice boomed now like a cathedral bell. I could not answer him, but he waited for no reply. Out of the ether, out of the omnipresent ether, from whose intangible substance the mind of God made the planets, all living things. Man has made these by his evil thoughts, by his selfish panics, by his lusts, and his interminable, never-ending hate. He has made them, and they are everywhere. Fear nothing. They cannot harm your body, but let your spirit beware. Fear nothing, but see where there comes to you its creator, the shape and body of your fear. And as he said that, I perceived a great thing coming towards me. A thing. The consciousness could not endure no more. A thing. A ringing, threatening voice merged into a roar within my ears. And there came a merciful dimming of the terrible, lurid vision, and blank nothingness succeeded upon horror, too great for the bearing. Part 4. There was a dull, heavy pain above my eyes. I knew that they were closed and that I was dreaming. The rack full of coloured bottles which I'd see so clearly was no more than part of the dream. There was some vague but imperative reason why I should rouse myself. I wanted to awaken, and thought that by staring very hard indeed I could dissolve this foolish vision of blue and yellow-brown bottles. But instead of dissolving, they grew clearer, more solid and substantial of appearance, until suddenly the rest of my senses rushed to the sport of sight, and I became aware that my eyes were open, that the bottles were quite real, that I was sitting in a chair, fallen sideways so that my cheek rested most uncomfortable on the table which held the rack. I straightened up slowly and with difficulty, groping in my dull brain for some clue to my presence in this unfamiliar place. This laboratory was lighted only by the rays of an arc light in the street outside its 3 large windows. Here I sat alone, and if the aching of cramped limbs meant anything, here I had sat for more than a little time. Then, with the painful shock which accompanies awakening to the knowledge of some great catastrophe, came memory. It was this very room, shown by the street lamps raised to be empty of life, which I had seen thronged with creatures too loathsome for description. I staggered to my feet, was staring fearfully about. There were the glass-floored cases, the bookshelves, the two tables with their burdens, and the long iron sink above which now only a dark blotch of shadow hung the lamp from which emanated that livid, terrifically revealing illumination. But the experience had been no dream, but a frightful reality. I was alone here now, with callous indifference my strange host had allowed me to remain for hours unconscious, with not the least effort to aid or revive me. Perhaps hating me so, he had hoped I would die there. At first I made no effort to leave the place. His appearance filled me with reminiscent loathing. I longed to go, but as yet felt too weak and ill for the effort. Both mentally and physically my condition was deplorable. And for the first time I realized that a shock to the mind may react upon the body as vilely as any debauch of self-indulgence. Quivering in every nerve and muscle, dizzy with headache and nausea, I dropped back into the chair, hoping that before the old man returned I might recover sufficient self-control to escape him. I knew that he hated me, and why. As I waited sick and miserable, I understood the man. Shuddering, I recalled the loathsome horrors he had shown me. The mere desires and emotions of mankind were daily carnified in such forms as those. No wonder that he viewed his fellow beings with detestation and longed only to destroy them. I thought, too, of the cruel, sensuous faces I'd seen in the streets outside, seen for the first time as if a veil had been withdrawn from my eyes, hitherto blinded by self-delusion. Fatuously trustful as a month-old puppy, I'd lived in a grim, evil world where goodness is a word and crude selfishness the only actuality. Drearily, my thoughts drifted back through my own life, its futile purposes, mistakes, and activities. All of the evil I knew returned to overwhelm me. Our gropings towards divinity were a sham, a writhing somewhat of slime-covered beasts who claimed sunlight as their heritage, but in their hearts preferred the foul and easy depth. Even now, though I could neither see nor feel them, this room, the entire world, was cruel with the beings created by our real natures. I recalled the cringing, contemptible fear to which my spirit had so readily yielded, and the faceless thing to which the emotion had given birth. Then abruptly, shockingly, I remembered that every moment I was adding to the horde, since my mind could conceive only repulsive incubi, and since while I lived I must think, feel, and so continue to shape them. Was there no way to check so abominable a succession? My eyes fell on the long shelves with their many-coloured bottles. In the chemistry of photography, there are deadly poisons. I knew that. Now was the time to end it. Now. Let him return and find his desire accomplished. One good thing I could do, if one only, I could abolish my monster creating self. Part 5. My friend Mark Jenkins is an intelligent and usually a very careful man. When he took the Smiler Callahan, a cigar which had the very appearance of being excellent, innocent Havana, the act denoted both intelligence and caution. A very clever work, he had traced the poisoning of young Ralph Peeler to Mr. Callahan's door, and he believed this particular cigar to be the mate of one smoked by Peeler just previous to his demise. And if, upon arresting Callahan, he had not confiscated this bit of evidence, it would have doubtless been destroyed by its regrettably unconscious owner. But when Jenkins shortly afterwards gave me that cigar as one of his own, he committed one of those almost inconceivable blunders which I think are occasionally forced upon clever men to keep them from overweening vanity. Discovering his slight mistake, my detective friend spent the night searching for his unintended victim, myself. That his search was successful was due to Pietro Marini, a young Italian of Jenkins' acquaintance, whom he had met about an hour of 2 a.m., returning from a dance. Now, Marini had seen me standing on the steps of the house where Dr. Frederick Holt had his laboratory and living rooms, and he had stared at me, not with any ill intent, but because he thought I was the sickest-looking, most ghastly specimen of humanity that he had ever beheld. And sharing the superstition of his South Street neighbours, he wondered if the worthy doctor had poisoned me as well as Peeler. This suspicion he imparted to Jenkins, who, however, had the best of reasons for believing otherwise. Moreover, as he informed Marini, Holt dead, having drowned himself late the previous afternoon. An hour or so after our talk in the restaurant, news of his suicide reached Jenkins. It seemed wise to search any place where a very sick-looking young man had been seen to enter. So Jenkins came straight to the laboratory. Across the fronts of these houses was a long sign with its mysterious inscription, "See the Great Unseen." Not at all mysterious to the detective. He knew that next door to Dr. Holt's, the second floor, had been thrown together into a lecture room, where at certain hours a young man employed by settlement workers displayed upon a screen stereopticon views of various deadly bacilli, the germs of diseases appropriate to dirt and indifference. He knew, too, that Dr. Holt himself had helped the educational effort along by providing some really wonderful lantern slides done by micro-colour photography. On the pavement outside, Jenkins found the two-thirds remnant of a cigar, which he gathered in and came up the steps, a very miserable and self-reproachful detective. Neither outer nor inner door was locked, and in the laboratory he found me, alive, but on the verge of death by another means than he had feared. In the extreme physical depression following my awakening from drugged sleep and knowing nothing of its cause, I believed my adventure fact in its entirety. My mentality was at too low an ebb to resist its dreadful suggestions. I was searching among Hulk's various bottles when Jenkins burst in. At first I was merely annoyed at the interruption of my purpose, but before the anticlimax of this explanation, the mists of obsession drifted away and left me still sick in body, but in spirit happy as any man may well be who has suffered a delusion that the world is wholly bad, and learned that its badness springs from his own poisoned brain. The malice which I had observed in every face, including young Marini's, existed only in my drug-affected dream. Last week's popular science lecture had been recalled to my subconscious mind, the mind that rules dreams and delirium, by the photographic apparatus in Holt's workroom. See the Great Unseen assisted materially, and even the corner drugstore, before which I had paused with its green-lit show vases, had doubtless played a part. But presently, following something Jenkins told me, I was driven to one protest. "If Holt was not here," I demanded, "if Holt is dead, as you say, how do you account for the fact that I, who have never seen the man, was able to give you an accurate description, which you admit to be that of Dr. Frederick Holt?" He pointed across the room. It was a life-size bust portrait in crayons, a picture of a white-haired man with bushy eyebrows and the most piercing black eyes I'd ever seen until the previous evening. It hung facing the door and near the windows, and the features stood out with a strangely lifelike appearance in the white rays of the arc lamp just outside. "Upon entering," continued Jenkins, "the first thing you saw was that portrait, and from it your delirium grew to living, speaking man. So there you are. There is your white-haired showman, your unnatural fear, your colour photography, and your pretty green bottles all nicely explained for you. Pretty green creatures all nicely explained for you. And thank God you're alive to hear the explanation. If you had smoked the whole of that cigar, well, never mind. You didn't. And now, my very dear friend, I think it's high time that you interviewed a real flesh and blood doctor. I'll phone a taxi." "Don't," I said. "A walk in the fresh air will do me more good than 50 doctors." "Fresh air? There's no fresh air in South Street in July," complained Jenkins, but reluctantly yielded. "I had a reason for my preference. I wished to see people, to meet face to face even such stray prowlers as might be about at this hour, nearer sunrise than midnight, and rejoice in the goodness and kindliness of human countenance, particularly as I found it in the lower classes. But even as we were leaving, there occurred to me a curious inconsistency. Jenkins," I said, "you claim that the reason Holt, when I first met him in the hall, appeared to twice close the door in my face was because the door never opened until I myself unlatched it." "Yes," confirmed Jenkins, but he frowned, foreseeing my next question. "Then why, if it was from that picture that I built so solid, so convincing a vision of a man, did I see Holt in the hall before the door was open?" "You confuse your memories," retorted Jenkins rather shortly. "Do I? Holt was dead at that hour. But I tell you, I saw Holt outside the door. What was his reason for committing suicide? Before my friend could reply, I was across the room, fumbling in the dusk there at the electric lamp above the sim. I got the tin flap open and pulled out the sliding screen, which consisted of 2 sheets of glass with fabric between, dark on one side, yellow on the other. With it came the very thing I dreaded, a sheet of whitish parchment-like, slightly opalescent stuff. Jenkins was beside me as I held it at arm's length toward the windows. Through it, the light of the arc lamp fell, divided into the most astonishingly brilliant hues. And instead of diminishing the light, it perceptibly increased it in the oddest of ways. Almost one thought that the sheet itself was luminous, and yet when held in the shadow it gave off no light at all. "Shall we put it in the lamp again and try it?" asked Jenkins slowly, and in his voice there was no hint of mockery. I looked him straight in the eyes. "No," I said, "he won't." I was drugged. Perhaps in that condition I received a merciless revelation of the discovery that caused Holt's suicide. But I don't believe it. Ghost or no ghost, I refuse to ever again believe in the depravity of the human race. If the air and the earth are teeming with invisible horrors, they are not of our making, and the study of demonology is better let alone. Shall we burn this thing or tear it up? "You have no right to do either," returned Jenkins thoughtfully. "But you know, Blaisdell, there's a little too darn much realism about these parts of your dream. I haven't been smoking any doped cigars. And when you held up to the light, I swear I saw a... never mind. Burn it. Send it back to the place it came from." "South America?" said I. "A hotter place than that. Burn it." So we struck a match, and we did, and it was gone in one great white flash. A large place was given by morning papers to the suicide of Dr. Frederick Holt, caused, it was summarized, by mental derangement brought about by his unjust implication in the Peeler murder. It seemed an inadequate reason, since he had never been arrested, but no other was ever discovered. Of course, our action in destroying that membrane was illegal and rather precipitate, but though we won't talk about it, I know Jenkins agrees with me. Doubt is sometimes better than certainty. There are marvels better left unproved. Those, for instance, which concern the powers of evil. Unseen, Unfeared, by Francis Stevens or Gertrude Bennett. All around you, manifestation, your evil. Hello, loopy low. Did you enjoy it? Thank you, Biffalot. I found that a fascinating little story. Yes, thank you. I enjoyed reading it. Nasty little thing, isn't it? Right now we are surrounded by unseen globules of... What did you see? What did you see? I know what I saw. I got a bad back.